it can seem a little disorganized. You'll see all different types of objects made of all different types of materials, finished to different levels of quality, all displayed together, kind of lumped in and thrown all together, seemingly at random, and attributed to often the same culture, the same time period, lots of discrepancies. I don't want to be hypercritical, I can be, but in the 19th and 20th centuries, it would probably have been pretty difficult, right? You had correspondence, you had physical notes, we had libraries, journals, handwritten accounts of things. A Google search was like flipping through a card catalog. So it wasn't easy, and overshadowing all of this was this Victorian era set of ideas about like culture, race, religion, evolution. So I think they probably did what they thought was right at the time. That's fine. My issue is that at this point, science needs to adapt to new information that's come to light. Okay, this is the timeline of Egypt. It's been taught for about 200 years now. It was established in the mid-1800s. I'm talking about this old, middle, late kingdom idea here down here. So the pyramids are said to have been built Old Kingdom. Now, almost immediately, this is like mid-1800s, almost immediately by the end of the century, the late 1800s, this was already being challenged within 50 years. Petrie excavated a place called Nakata, and these were one of the first times that these artifacts that we're talking about today were first documented. Now today, 150 years later, there's now evidence to suggest that humans were around at the beginning of the Pleistocene, around 2 million years ago, right? And then we have this entire 700,000 year span called the Paleolithic era. That's almost never talked about, but as it turns out, things were found there. Stone tools found throughout the entire timeline. Structures dating back 100,000 years. A flint workshop, an actual fabrication facility near Dendera 55,000 years ago, and other types of tools. So this notion that human culture just started with dynastic Egypt, I think is just, in my opinion, complete nonsense. And what's so odd about this is that some of the most impressive vessels, in terms of the accuracy and the precision, are acknowledged to come from a time before dynastic Egypt. This is according to mainstream thought, mainstream archaeologists and Egyptologists. And in general, the less impressive vessels are typically more recent. So this one's from the Middle Kingdom or the Middle Dynasty, like 1400 BC circa. It's pottery painted to look like stone. Okay, and the explanation here, maybe you can see it. It's amazing. This is a high priest. He was too poor for stone. Okay, right. So in other words, no one knew how to make them anymore, I think was what you can read into that. Much of what's known in academia is really based on an incomplete data set. Stone can vary a lot. We have this thing called the Mohs scale, which is really describing the hardness of minerals, not stone. But stone's made up of minerals, so you can take a typical composition of what, say, granite or diorite is, and then get kind of like a range. And so all this is saying is like a 6 can cut a 5, but not a 7. So it's a relative scale. And then we see the difference between some of the more popular stones on the right. The difference between diorite and granite, because they're easily confused, is diorite just lacks quartz effectively. It's usually a little bit softer. Now note that sandstone, which is right here, is about a 6 or a 7 that was used by the dynastics. It is hard stone, but it is a lot easier to cut and work. We just don't see it in vessels. And note down here, corundum, it's one of the hardest minerals just under diamond. In terms of absolute hardness, now this is not relative, so as you can see, a diamond is like 15 times harder than quartz and 4 times harder than corundum. Quartz will cut almost anything except for the stuff above it. Here are some granite vessels. A lot of these we've examined, and some porphyry. So porphyry usually contains these giant crystals, crystal inclusions as some people call them. They're typically feldspar, which is a little bit softer than quartz, but just about as hard. It's made up of all different types of minerals, so the hardness of different types of porphyry can vary actually quite a bit. Here's some more. This is from the British Museum. This is kind of a famous picture. And then trachyte porphyry is rare in most of the world, but it does happen to come from Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa, so I think we're comfortable that we know where this comes from. A lot of the porphyry vessels that we've examined, us, at least in terms of like the analysis that we've done, are not ultra precise, but they're very impressive nonetheless. One of the reasons I like them a lot, they're pretty, obviously, but if you look at these crystals, these giant crystals, they're a much different hardness than the ground mass, the material that's interspersed in the actual body, but they're cut to the same degree in the same shape. So I think that's highly impressive, difficult work, regardless of the fact that the accuracy might not be as high as some of the granites. Johanna actually mentioned this yesterday in her presentation on India, like very similar concept. More porphyry vessels here. So some have these gold handles. I strongly suspect these were added much later, maybe by the dynastics themselves. Why? Well, it appears that the holes were added later. Let's see if you guys can see this. I don't know if you can see, but if you look at the right hole versus the left hole, the drill holes don't align, they're like disjoint, right? So that's a far inferior type of workmanship than what went into the actual vessel body itself. Some of these have lug handles with no holes at all. So I believe they were probably added later. This is gneiss, a type of diorite. This is a lighter version of it. It's actually harder than the darker version because of the mineral content. So even within the same family, stone can vary quite a bit. Another gneiss bowl. This is beautiful. These are diorite vessels. And then greywacke. So greywacke is a sedimentary stone. It's like siltstone, grayish green. It's stunning in statue form. We don't really see too many bowls or vessels, although there are some. But this is Tutmosis, allegedly, and Menkaure, I think. And the middle statue you'll see in the Luxor Museum, usually there's a crowd of tourists just kind of standing around it like gawking, and I've done that and been there. So I don't really know who made these or when, and I'm not actually suggesting that these are made to the same level of precision or accuracy as the vessels. I think, in fact, they might not be, but they do seem to display some pretty good qualities of precision nonetheless, and they would have been cut with some type of machinery or technology. Schist and siltstone, breccia. Breccia is just a Roman word for rubble, and it's a heterogeneous material, so again, it would have been difficult to cut and shape like this, even if it's not quite as hard as the quartz-based rocks. This is basalt. It's a black volcanic stone, and serpentine, which is a metamorphic rock. It's got this greenish hue. It's also quite nice to look at. It's about a 6, roughly, on the Mohs scale, so hard to cut. So the story here, and the reason I'm kind of focused on these things and what convinced me initially, I've heard some of this information over time, really has like 3 components to it. One is there's tons of these things. 40,000 alone were found under the step pyramid at Saqqara. Many thousands more were found in pre-dynastic Naqada, Nubia, and elsewhere by archaeologists. 2, dynastic Egyptians. Dynastic Egyptians collected these things, just like our archaeologists do today, from earlier burials and tombs. They're considered pre-dynastic by academia, so this is not really disputed. Dynastic Egyptians, at least in my opinion, and I don't think anything supports that they had the knowledge or the tools to actually make these themselves. And then lastly, Egyptologists claim these were made by hand with primitive tools. The time to make one stone vessel is estimated in years, plural. So there's something, I think, profound about this story. This is a big story that has largely been ignored. Location. So where did archaeologists today, find these things generally? Well, it turns out it came from up and down Egypt, generally according to where the Nile flows or used to flow. And Egypt used to incorporate what's now northern Sudan. So we have Lower Egypt, so that's Saqqara up top, right near Cairo. We have Upper Egypt, which includes like Abydos, Naqada, places like that. And then Kush and Lower Nubia. This is like the northern Sudan region. Now there's an artificial line there, across there. And that includes regions like Aniba and Tashka. And we'll talk about those in a minute. Most of these are labeled cemeteries, except for Saqqara, just because burials were found there. So then the whole region's a cemetery, right? A lot of these are underwater in the south when Lake Nasser and the dam was created. So the first area I want to discuss is Upper Egypt. So this is in the middle of that map that I just showed. And it's called Naqada. So excavated by Petrie in the late 1890s or late 1800s, middle 1890s, and other people as well. Again, this is only like 50 years after that concept of Old Middle Late Kingdom. Naqada is this huge sprawling cemetery. Thousands of years of burials here. So we have pre-dynastic people, we have dynastic people, we have everything after that, which is basically Greeks, Romans, Coptics, all that stuff. So it's really unbelievably massive. Now this was shocking the first time Egyptologists excavated it. And the first time, again, that this traditional timeline of Egypt was really questioned. We see human burials here different from anything before. All of them are unmummified, and a lot of them are in this kind of like fetal flex position, if you will, buried with pottery and stone vessels. And it's the first time that the objects themselves were actually considered more important than the human burials. Because these vessels were so impressive and different from anything previously found, Petrie actually thought this was a new race of humans. He thought they were invaders from Libya, and he thought that they founded ancient Egypt. Archaeologists, of course, they already knew everything. They already had this timeline baked out, so we just created a new category called pre-dynastic and stuck it all there. This is an image from the Petrie Museum. You can see a vessel there. So 3 important points about this area, Nakata and then other areas like it. Much more pottery was found than stone, a lot more. In fact, most of the graves only had pottery. When a minority of graves had these stone vessels, so only some, even though the nominal number is very high, it's in the many hundreds of thousands, only a few graves per site would have the stone. And then lastly, maybe most important, almost no tools were found. So I first heard this maybe 10 or 15 years ago again, and it always kind of struck me as funny and led me to believe that these were probably just heirlooms, right? These people were simple people. They didn't have the tools, they didn't necessarily have the means to make these things, and the fact that the concentrations were so low, I don't think they made them. This is what's found in Nakata. We have this classic pottery in the top right, this porphyry vessel here. We have breccia and diorite down in the lower left, and then here we have the alabaster. The alabaster vases here dated to the Middle Kingdom. Probably accurate. We know the dynastics did make these in large quantities. Alabaster is relatively soft, by the way. Also from Nakata, so these pictures are from a paper called Before the Pyramids by Dr. Emily Teeter of the University of Chicago. I reached out to her a while back because I wanted to get her opinion on the dating. My approach has been, throughout this kind of entire thing, has been to work with the mainstream community if it's possible and when. So I asked her, did she really believe that the pottery and the stone should be dated to the same age as what we typically see? This is a quote from her. So, the date for a stone vessel is based on archaeological context, especially the associated pottery, and the form of the stone vessel itself. Petrie kept very good excavation records, obviously before photography was feasible. There's very little or no doubt about the age of excavated stone vessels. The ones without archaeological context are a little trickier, but they can be dated based on their form. There may be debates to the exact date, for instance, Dynasty 1 or 2, but such vessels can be dated to pre-dynastic, early dynastic, and Old Kingdom periods with certainty. So she's not ready to turn her back on her illustrious career, a big surprise, I guess. But she did insist that the stone vessels we're talking about are pre-dynastic, definitely. There's no question. Why? Well, they're found in pre-dynastic burials, okay. But also because of the context. If the stone looks similar to pottery that we already know is old, and might be found alongside it perhaps, then we know the stone vessel must be old too. So at least we can agree on that much. Something. What did she mean when she said dated based on form? So this is where it gets really flaky. This is how Egyptology has worked for 150 years, since the 1800s. So the basic idea is you find a bunch of stuff, you draw little pictures of all these things on paper, and then you rearrange them and try to figure out what's older. You do that based on, again, this Victorian era evolutionary anthropology that tells you simple comes before complex, and then you rearrange them that way. That's it. That's really it. There's obviously problems here. It's ironic, though, because think about how this entire pre-dynastic thing came to be. We push this whole thing back because it doesn't fit within the Middle Late Kingdom theory, right? So Victorian archaeology is sometimes called armchair anthropology for a reason. Here are the problems with this. So we have lug handles on some vessels, but not all. This doesn't account for that at all. That doesn't factor into their scheme. Some of these have painted bottoms. Why would you paint the bottom of a frying pan or a pot that you're using, right? That doesn't make any sense. It would wear off and you're not going to see it, so why would you do it? A lot of these have painted bottoms. The time between the form change, or should there even be any time? How do we know how long is here between these different epochs or eras? There's no way of knowing. It also doesn't account for the materials, those pottery versus stone. There's no account for that. And then the practical usage with bottoms, like you see some of these conical shaped bottoms, how would you balance that? You'd need a separate container to hold the container. So I think this is too simple of a method. It assumes this linear progression and evolution, and it ignores the possibility that any of these things could be imitations of something maybe much older. So this form-based sequence dating leads to problems like this. These are dated the same age based on their form. The thing on the left that's serpentine, it's pretty hard. It's a metamorphic rock. It's about a 6. And it looks pretty nice. It looks fairly symmetrical. I haven't analyzed this one at all, but it still looks good after, 5,500 years. They're both dated to the same age. But the thing on the right this decrepit, disintegrating piece of pottery, it doesn't look symmetrical whatsoever. Now, these are said to be made by the same group of people at the same time. I think this is like reprehensible logic, and it's not scientific. Now, this is from Emily Teeter's paper. So what she was doing here, and she has a lot of pictures like this. Again, the exact same thing I was just saying. She points this out in multiple papers that she's put forth over the years, and doesn't actually call it out as being illogical. She's actually trying to demonstrate, hey, this is how the form-based dating system works, which is kind of funny. It sort of just illustrates my point.